I'm Frank Vaughn. It's November 25th, 2025, and I woke this morning with a splitting headache, so you will have to bear with me as I navigate this particular video. I want to continue the examination of the worsening economic conditions for the people of Canada, the plebs, of which I am one, comparing that and contrasting that with the position of the oligarchs who are managing Canada's decline, and they certainly aren't managing that decline to your advantage, to the advantage of the average person. This is going up the pyramid. It's not coming down the pyramid. On screen, delinquency rates. This is mortgage delinquencies. And the statistics that's displayed, the yellow line is Ontario, the blue line is Toronto. For those who are listening, you just need to understand that the trend is basically parabolically up. And we are at just the beginning of the troubles, because the real issue that's going to become a factor is this. From January to October of 2021, 1 million Canadians, and that's Canadian households. That's not a household is typically more than one person. It's usually people with kids. 1 million Canadian households locked in 5-year fixed rate mortgages at 1.4, 1.5%. My word, when I signed my first mortgage in 2010, 2011, whatever it was 2.95% or 3.15%. A man with a lot of gray hair verging on white told me it was the cheapest mortgage he'd ever issued out of the bank. He was very proud of it. And when I came up for renewal, I signed at that price or a little bit lower. When I came up for my second renewal, it was basically the same story. I would have never imagined that you could get in at 1.4 or 1.5%. Those rates are crazy, and they have consequences. Now, I said in my post that those renewals start in January of 26 at 3.8% or higher. Home values have tanked, risking refinancing problems. The real mortgage cliff is just beginning, and it doesn't seem to make headlines. And it doesn't. We're being gaslit by CMHC. When the media does talk about the housing market, it's to basically say that now's the time to buy. Terrible advice. Why is CBC, that you spend all of this money financing, giving you absolutely terrible advice that flies in the face of the facts? Why is nobody presenting the facts? Why is CMHC, ostensibly an insurance company that underwrites mortgage values, you, the home buyer, pay the premium to protect the bank? So you're buying insurance on behalf of the bank to make sure that their losses are covered, and you get screwed. And this is how there's a lot of Canadians that are coming into some severe financial trouble, which is why Mike Harding here, he doesn't make any sense to me. Payments aren't up much. Some people are going to have to sell one of their cars or cancel their subscriptions, which just seems to me a very flippant flick of the wrist as regards the avalanche of problems that are coming to the Canadian economy. And I said to him, what part of it hasn't started? Don't you understand? The real hurt doesn't start landing until 2026 and will last beyond 2026. And he says, I do this for a living. Renewal payments are up only 20% or so, even if rates are doubled or more. It's called amortization. Look it up. And so I sent him this statistic, and he said our 90-day delinquency rates are not up. Our 30-day have increased insignificantly. We do about 4 billion originations per year the last few years. The thing about a person who's in the industry, who makes their living by portraying that everything is normal, has a really hard time, either consciously or subconsciously, actually seeing the bad data. They're disincentivized to accept reality. And the reality is spelled out in the charts. The reality is spelled out in the statistics. So you have to be very careful. I don't know what Mike's motivations are, but for some reason he is willfully blind to the problems that are coming to Canadian real estate. But you got to be careful. When you do business with anybody, make sure you do business with people who win when you win. Don't do business with people who win whether you win or lose, because a lot of them aren't going to care if you get wrecked. There are people with integrity out there. Mike might be one of them. Maybe he just doesn't understand the data that he's looking at. I don't know. But there are people out there who have integrity, and you should seek them out because they have helped me out in life several times. But going back, so that we understand what's going to happen here. January 2026, are when the first renewals at the lowest interest rates, that the renewals on mortgages that were signed at the lowest interest rates hit the market, start impacting the statistics. So they will have to renew at 2 to 3x their entry rate. And this process is going to play out into 2026 and will not peak until about halfway through 2026, give or take a month. So delinquencies are going to go up. The other problem is that valuations are falling. Now, again, there are people out there who will tell you that it's not that bad. Even if you talk to AI, AI is going to give you statistics derived from Zillow or MPAC or any number of other things that I would almost argue their business models are designed around higher valuations than you can actually get on the market. The real data that you need to understand is how much time is a house or a condo sitting on the market, and how many times are the prices getting revised down, and what do they finally sell when they finally get to the bottom. And the fact is, people are taking 30, 40% haircuts on the values of their home. They're not getting what they thought they were worth because the market is cratering in real time. We're in the midst of it. It's happening. The exponential rise the exponential decline is only just getting started. So you're going into a bank or you're going into a private broker to renew your mortgage. Pretty simple process if you stick with the same institution. But if that institution comes back at you and says, we're willing to renew your mortgage at 4%, 5%, but down the street, you've got somebody that's willing to do it a little bit lower, and you want to take advantage of that because you owe an ungodly amount of money on a house you overpaid for, because that's the other side of this. When you bought that house in 2021, leading into 2022, you overpaid. It was the peak of the market, and there was a real mania. My derelict farmhouse had 89 viewings in 7 days. It was a zoo. I'm not really sure what people were thinking. I mean, good for me that they were, but that's the way the situation was. I wouldn't have bought in Ontario at that point. I couldn't have bought in Ontario at that point, even though I had a house to sell. I had to move 2,200 kilometers to get a sufficient deal to be able to get a house that was big enough for my family. But that's beside the point. You overpaid for a house. You signed a really cheap mortgage. And then most of these households will have just made the payments. They will either have paid their monthly mortgage or they'll have paid bi-weekly. They will have continued living their lives, looking at credit card debt, looking at personal debt. That is increasing in Canada, so they're spending faster than they have it coming in. So a lot of them aren't making extra payments on their mortgage. So month by month, time goes by, and then they have to come up for renewal, and these cheap mortgages are turning into expensive ones on their expensive houses. Expensive in their minds because the value is going down. So now, when you try to renew, you might have issues with refinancing. Because if your house can only fetch $500,000 or $600,000, but you paid $750,000 or $800,000 for it, you have a problem. You have a greater, you have more debt than you have worth in your house. And so the bank might demand a reappraisal of the value, or they might demand that you collateralize the difference. So they're willing to give you a mortgage, but you got to come up with $150,000 in collateral to keep the thing going. And you have to agree to a much higher interest rate while you do that. That's a much bigger problem than canceling subscriptions and just a few $100s. Most Canadians don't have a few $100s to spare. And it's not $300. It's going to be a lot more starting in 2026. The honest bros out there, that's who it is. Predominantly, I've just been watching men. I haven't seen, there just hasn't been a lot of female commentary coming across my desk. It probably exists out there. They're probably telling the truth too. I just haven't seen it. That's why I'm using the word bro. But you're seeing the honest ones are telling you this story and trying to warn you. Meanwhile, CMHC and the Canadian media are trying to get you to buy. They're trying to get you to sign here. They're trying to get you locked in an effort to prop up the real estate market, I guess, through propaganda. It's kind of like Ukraine. trying to portray that they're winning the war against Russia through propaganda, when the reality on the ground is they're losing vast square kilometers of territory every single day. The Russian war machine is marching across the Ukrainian landscape in spite of what Europe and the Zelensky regime wants to say. It's kind of the same thing in Canada. We're just going to pretend our way out of the crisis that's coming, even as the central bank, and this is another one, people deny it. You go to the central banks, you go to the Bank of Canada's website, and they admit they're starting QE again. The QT is over. They bury it in a bunch of language and call it routine and all this other nonsense, but December 16th, they're going to start creating money out of nothing, and they're going to deposit it right in the bank or in the Government of Canada's bank account so that they can spend it wherever they want. Which brings us into something else, which is Carney's ongoing conflicts of interest. But to just put a bow on this point, the trouble hasn't started yet, even as delinquencies inch up. Another thought that comes to mind, and this fellow will probably be watching this video, I was having a conversation with a long-time Toronto resident, and we were commiserating. Well, he was telling me, I was mentally commiserating. I haven't actually recorded a message back to him yet. About the Toronto of old. There are those who are telling you that Toronto and Vancouver, everything is great. Nothing's been better. I've seen YouTubers who go there through the day, and they're like, oh, there's no homeless problem. Everything's fine here. Everything looks great. But at nighttime, when you're walking the streets, as my friend sometimes does, every 20 meters, you're tripping over homeless people sleeping on top of grates. He was talking about how 10, 20 years ago, and I remember this because I live near there. I used to go up to Toronto every now and again. I've never been a big fan of the city, but I still went there as a young man looking for my future, I guess. And there used to be all these Tim Hortons and coffee shops and places that were open all night that you could actually go in and have a coffee, and you could sit around all night just drinking your coffee. And, you know, in a civil society that actually has a high degree of trust, these things can happen. But just like Oshawa, Ontario, just like Toronto, just like all of these other cities, all the 24-hour places are disappearing. And really, there's only shawarma shops left and a few other little things. But all of the trust has disappeared. The homeless are everywhere. The place is becoming India. It's becoming the third world. And the trust has evaporated. Not a poppy in sight. One of the most depressing things I've seen over the Remembrance Day, you know, my discourse over the last several years when it comes to Remembrance Day is always the same thing. We forgot, and it's clear we forgot. The Remembrance Day parade in Toronto has become a shadow of its former glory. People don't line up on the streets anymore, emblazoning their clothes with poppies to watch this memory, this living memory, march by. The streets were virtually empty. And it was like a tragic chorus, or I don't want to call it a theatrical display because it's so important to the record and memory of our nation. But it was like an orchestra playing to an empty theater. You know, it's just one of the most depressing sights. So we can see the change. You can see the fence zombies. You can see the meth heads. You can see the destruction, not just in the biggest cities, but also in the small cities that surround them. You can see it, but you're continually being gaslit that there isn't a problem and it isn't new. Cobourg, Ontario has a homeless camp now. There are places where I can watch. Cobourg is one of my old stomping grounds. There's places where people upload videos on a regular basis of the fence zombies and the meth heads that are just wandering around Cobourg streets. Man, there's shootings and murders that happen that are drug-related in that town. These are just, it's not like it didn't happen before, I guess, but it was out of sight. The numbers were way lower. Things are getting bad out there. And you're constantly being lied to and told that they're not. And when it comes to lying with intent, when it comes to misleading the vast swaths of the Canadian public and doing so effectively, our current Prime Minister has got to be the absolute worst. Actually, I was going to start here, but I think what we're going to do is we're going to go to my Twitter again, or my X, whatever the hell we call it, and I'm going to read a post that resonates. If you are demanding Canadians buy Canadian, why aren't you demanding Canadian companies hire Canadians? because we have a slave class in this country. People need to understand that. The TFWs and the IMP program, this is a slave class. They displace Canadian workers, and they have very short leases. They are brought in to service foreign-owned companies, and there's nothing Canadian about it. Or demanding Canadian pensions invest in Canada more heavily. I talked about in a previous video at length how the Canada Pension Plan, how the public sector pensions, how the private pensions, they keep the vast 85% plus of their money is outside this country. They're not building Canada, they're building other nations and getting a return on it. And people will say, a pension isn't supposed to be patriotic. A pension is supposed to guarantee returns, as if that dissuades from my point, which is Canada's in a bad way and no one wants to touch it. With all the gaslighting we're getting about the UAE investments and Malaysia is going to save the day and India, oh, they're coming to our rescue. India, it's been so good for Canada. We're being gaslit. The real money, the Canadian money, the money that is forcibly extracted out of your paychecks is being offshored. Yelling is a bit of a double-edged sword today because it hurts my own brain, so I'm going to calm down and continue. Or the Canadian tax dollars stay in Canada and aren't shipped overseas. We're broke. We're running an $80 billion deficit just this year, and apparently we're not in a crisis, though we are. You know, if you watch this channel, we're in a multifaceted crisis. During the election campaign, they were telling you the truth about emergencies, though they were blaming the wrong person. They were blaming the orange man. It's really about the liquidation of Canada and the people who have been running the show for the last 10, even 20 years. We can extend it out. Harper was no hero in my mind. Okay, this is a bipartisan statement. Things definitely accelerated in 2015. It's funny. The year that the world central banks became net buyers of gold, that was the year that Canada finished selling off all of our gold. And I don't blame Justin Trudeau for that because there was very little left by the time he got his hands on it. It was sold off it was a bipartisan salesmanship. It was actually Brian Mulroney that sold the majority of it, but we're getting distracted. We should close Global Affairs Canada, and we should keep all our money here. But we're not doing that. We're not even keeping our own money. We'd be just keeping money that we're borrowing from the Bank of Canada that's printing it, which is robbing you. When they create money out of nothing and deposit it right in the government of Canada's bank account and they go out and spend it, they're spending the money out of your pocket without even increasing your taxes. It's literally what's happening. It's crazy. Michael Stepchuk says, because there's no legal basis for refusing to hire due to citizenship in Canada. Your pension question is vague, but pensioners really want viable pensions. So he's admitting that you can't have a viable pension by investing in Canada. What does that say? Or there's no legal basis. I said we create legal bases for things all the time. The pension question is only vague because you have no knowledge of where the CPP and public sector pensions invest, primarily not in Canada. There's a lot of people who just aren't getting the problem. But anyway, we have to go back to this because we got to discuss Mark Carney directly, and we need to have a listen.
Brookfield, when Brookfield's value increases, the value of stock options and deferred share units also increase. That's how these instruments work, correct?
Yes, when our share price increases, the value of those instruments do increase, yes.
And that basic reality doesn't change simply because those instruments would be placed in a blind trust. The value would still rise when the value of Brookfield rises, correct?
Yes.
So if someone holds Brookfield options and units in a blind trust or not, they personally benefit when Brookfield performs well. Isn't that right?
Anybody who holds those instruments, whether during employment or following employment, derives the benefit from those instruments. That's correct.
So without making you watch the entire clip, it should be very clear what's being communicated here. Mark Carney still owns all of his stock in Brookfield. He still owns all of his stock in all of his various projects. He's placed them in a so-called blind trust, but there's nothing blind about it. The relationship between Brookfield benefiting from his actions as prime minister will lead to their stock going up. I mean, people are like, yep, I've invested in Brookfield because it's obvious what kind of a scam is being run on Canada right now. And there are those who are willing to take a share of what I would call blood money. as Canada is being drained. But another interesting thing
instrument
that would highlight my point is there's a lot of upset about Brookfield moving their headquarters to New York. Now, it's Brookfield Asset Management's headquarters. Brookfield itself is still headquartered in Canada, so it's a division. But the reason they're doing it is to try and become included in the S&P 500. It's trying to get better access. That's what this whole article is about, is getting better access to American markets. Why? Because it's more lucrative. The Americans are building. There's other areas of the world that are building. Man, I wanted to get into Enbridge today, and I don't think I'm going to get there. I'll have to try and get into it tomorrow. Because there's a lot of foot in the world. The center of the world is no longer Europe. The center of the world is shifting to Asia, perhaps North America. There might be two centers of the world if we're smart enough. I really want to get into it just a little bit. Asia is working to set up a new international settlement system. They're all racing to acquire gold reserves, and I think that's going to be a big component. It's going to be a settlement layer. Might not be a currency that's backed by gold directly, but it might be redeemable. I don't want to get into the particulars of it. Asia's getting ready to challenge the US dollar's role as a reserve currency. And the president of the United States and his vice president have both indicated that it might be to the benefit of the United States for that role to end. They've both said it publicly. This isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. A strong US dollar directly opposes what they want to do, which is bring business back and get America starting to build things. This concept of Fortress North America. Most of the nations involved in building this counter system are authoritarian nations. They're top-down nations, not with strong democratic traditions. We're talking about China. We're talking about Saudi Arabia. I guess you could say India's democracy. I don't know. They still got the caste system. If you're born, the class you're born into is the one you stay in forever. There's no upward mobility. Doesn't sound all that great. And I mean, you look at the conditions of their streets, you look at the conditions of their rivers, you look at the conditions of their bathrooms, and you can understand that it's not really a country I look to for my inspiration. But they're setting up an alternative system. The only reasonable counter to it, because Europe is weak. Europe is very weak. They're on the world stage making all of these demands of Russia. And they're in no position to make demands. It's not just the battlefield in Ukraine. It's the economics of Europe. They're not resource heavy. They don't have any money. They're just as broke as everybody else. And they're not reckoning with the reality of their situation. So the center of the world is shifting. And there can be a new center of Western civilization, and that is North America. This concept of Fortress North America, that if you value Republican traditions, not Republican Party, but the Republic itself, if you value democratic traditions, if you value real concrete civil rights, then out of the ashes of the trouble that we're about to face, we can construct something that is a rival anchor to what's being set up in Asia, if we but had the vision. Now, it's really hard, and I've said this in previous videos, to actually read what Mark Carney is all about. Because there's days where I think he is cooperating with the United States, that there's some kind of plan to actually bring about Fortress North America that the Canadian people are too ignorant to understand the value of. There's a lot of Canadians that are anchored to the past, anchored to what we were, anchored to ideas of what Canada is that no longer exists, completely blind to the change that's undergoing, that the country's undergoing on every single city street. You can see it with your own eyes, blind to it, blind to the national debt rising, blind to the deficits, blind to the economic Ponzi scheme falling apart around them. So if you can't educate Canadians with their own eyes, how can you educate them some other way? There's this idea that Trump and Carney are coordinating, and I think there's bones on it. But there's also evidence that suggests that Carney is tying the Canadian ship to Europe, which I think is actually a stronger case. And Europe is sinking. It's a sinking ship. It's not the power basis of the world anymore. The World Economic Forum and these organizations in Europe are in the midst of failure. Those people who have been fighting the globalists, I got news for you. You won. The problem is there's a new phase. There's a new order coming. And positioning in that new order is really what's at stake now. The old order is fading away. But to bring this one to a finish, Mark Carney's not here. His government is not here to serve the welfare of the Canadian people. There's all of these deals being signed across this country with Brookfield. And while Brookfield's stock increases, so does Mark Carney's personal wealth. And when the Bank of Canada is creating money, walking across the road, buying treasuries, depositing that money right in the Government of Canada's bank account, and then the Government of Canada is going out and bankrolling projects that benefit Brookfield, well, we know exactly what happens.